What what we began to find is that actually at each of these gates, there are things that we need to take responsibility for as city leaders, things that have taken place historically. So my 2 points for us today are really, really simple. The first one is know your history, and the second one is seek to serve. So firstly, know your history. What we found as we began to look at each of these gates or points with them, each of them have a connection point into the city. Many of them have a history or things that have taken place there, or things that are going on now. If you look at number one on there, it says Burton next to it. That gate, that access point, is a well-known place in the city for suicide. And one of the things that we began to seek God on and pray into was the fact that actually we wanted to see the rate of suicide decrease. We wanted to get to the root causes of some of those things and pray into those things. And as we were praying into that, what we found was that actually the Samaritans founder called Chad Vara came from Lincoln, or was in Lincoln when he was a curate. And when he was in Lincoln, there's a really sad story where a young girl completed suicide when she first came on her period. And she didn't know what that was, didn't know what happened, and no one had ever told her. And so she very sadly ended her life. And so what Chad Vara said as he did her funeral was basically, not on my watch. This isn't going to happen. This is not acceptable. And so he began to use his own phone line at the vicarage as a line where people could phone if they wanted advice, help at any time. They could contact him. And eventually that kind of rolled out for the Samaritans. But he was in Lincoln when he was inspired to do that. And so we began to pray, God, let a spirit of that Chad Vara spirit rise up, so that actually the church will take responsibility to say, not on our watch. We began to pray into that, knowing the history that God had done this before. And what's been established now in the city was there was a woman called Stacey who then got a call from God to do something about the suicide rate. We've now partnered with the NHS and multiple churches across the city. Sean Wade's on this call as well, and Sean has been instrumental in making these things happen. And there's now a contract with the NHS for the church every night of the week to open its buildings to run safe spaces and cafes where anyone can come who's struggling or in need. And so we prayed for those things and asked God, come and do it again, not on our watch. We want to see a change to these things. And then the church has opened its doors and finance has been made available to make those things happen. And so what I believe is that actually, as we know our history, both in terms of the things God has done before and the negative things, there are huge things in the history of Lincoln, right the way back to the Roman establishment, to the establishment of the cathedral and the castle by William the Conqueror as places of power and control. That are very negative and negative influences in terms of their spiritual roots on the city. And even down to, if you look in history at the Jewish population being kicked out of the UK, some of that began in Lincoln. And so there, and led to all sorts of bloodshed, communities being attacked, many people killed. And I believe we have to take responsibility for those things by knowing our history and praying into those things and asking God to come and do something about it. I'm so inspired by Daniel in Daniel 9, where he repents on behalf of his forefathers' sins for God to come and move. And I believe it's the same thing, that actually we repent on behalf of those that have gone before us in order to see breakthrough. So know your history so that you can begin to see transformation. The second thing we did with this map is that the first thing that I started to do was a bit of an idea where I thought, we can have at each of these gates, 25 gates, 25 communities of prayer across denominations that will be praying at them regularly, be established to pray for those gates. And if I'm honest, I thought, wouldn't I look good if there were 25 communities across denominations that would be working? Now, we'd started this process and it's very, very slow going, very hard to get people engaged with it or connected to the idea. And then a prophetic word came to the city, that the city is known for empire and control. And so anytime there's an attempt to build an empire or something for yourselves, you need to lay that down and seek to serve rather than to build empire. And so I had some conversations with God, some honest conversations where I was like, I think in this, I'm trying to do something good for the city, but I'm trying to do it for a sense of myself and how it looks for me and my own empire. Look what Paul's established. He's got 25 communities of prayer built across the city for the city gates. And so I repented of that, laid it all down, said, God, that's not the way that we want to do it. We want to release this to be a place of serving for the city. So what we did was, with churches across the city at each of the gates, we asked people to write a prayer to seek God and to name them. And what you can see is that each of the gates has a new name that we're establishing as the church in Lincoln. So number 1, it's leadership. Number 2, shalom. Number 3 is rescue. And so it goes on from there all the way around. Each gate has a name and a specific prayer that's written by somebody locally to that area. And then what we did was we took this and we took it to the church in the city, and we said we want to release this as a resource for the city so that everyone can have access to it. So when you come in and out of the city, when you go to work, when you go to the shops, most people use similar routes, don't they? We're kind of creatures of habit, use similar routes in and out of the city. And so people are traveling across the same points fairly regularly. And so we just said to people, as you go about your normal everyday business, why don't you pray and use the prayers that are written here, use the titles that are on these gates to seek God. And what was most fascinating about it was I had a number of conversations with church leaders and with people about the city gates. And when we released it as a way of serving the city to resource people, the number of people who came to me saying, this is brilliant, I've never heard of this before. And I was like, I've told you about it. But I think when it's trying to build empire, it doesn't go anywhere. But when we're trying to seek to serve, that's when God comes to bless it. And that's what we've seen. So I want to encourage you in those two things. Know your history and the story of what's taken place before, both what God has done and what has taken place that has been negative, and seek God on those things, but also begin to seek to find ways to serve. The way that we found to do that is through the City Gates model, just to give people easy access. And know from different cities and towns across the country, there are different ways of praying for streets and for houses and for neighborhoods. And I don't think it's one size fits all, but I think there are some key principles that as we seek God and say, as communities and as churches, we're going to stand up and take responsibility and to say we're going to pray for our spaces and the land that God has positioned us in, then there are some different ways that we can pray. We found this to be quite a helpful way to map it out for us. And you might want to be inspired by that. I'm happy to talk more about those things and about things that we've done to pray into the history. Sean and Kathy on this call as well. I've got loads of stories of God's breakthrough in those areas. But two keys for us, I think: know your history and seek to serve. As we pray for our cities, I think are helpful. But that's some of our story in Lincoln in terms of City Gates and some of the journey that we've been on. And so I hope that inspires you a little bit. Mark?
Oh, what brilliant talk and perfectly timed. Well done. Thank you. Just a very quick question for you. Do you use social media to share this vision for prayer? And because when you look at sort of social, cultural, spiritual history, there is, I mean, it is quite possible, you know, to share that story via social media. Is that something that you encourage or not?
Yeah, I think in some sense, yeah. So we use Facebook fairly well. We've got a good Facebook group in terms of the city prayer, which Kathy oversees and does a great job with. And I think we're good on that. I don't think we've been that good perhaps at telling some of those linked up stories in terms of what God's done or the way that things have happened. I don't know about anybody else with prayer, but often when you get an answer to prayer, you're on to the next thing quite quickly in terms of, right, what's God going to do next? But I think taking time to celebrate would be good. I think there's possibly some things that we could learn there. But our Facebook group's fairly active, and during lockdown, that grew exponentially, really, in terms of connecting with people.
Amazing. What a brilliant story. Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere because I'm sure we'll want to come back and ask questions. But thank you, Paul. If I can go on to Ben Woolard now from Together Sheffield. Ben, I hope you don't mind us just limiting time. We just want a couple of snapshot stories from you and Greg. But can you give us 5 minutes or so on your Arise Sheffield prayer app and how that's gone?
Yeah, great. And just give me a 1 minute warning and I'll wind it down then. Such a privilege and pleasure to be here and recognise so many faces of just inspiring people who we've definitely been inspired by and by your stories. So my name's Ben Woolard. I have the privilege of leading the team at Together for Sheffield. So we're a unity group that seeks to empower and bless the local church across the city. So under our umbrella comes sort of the Churches Together, which in Sheffield is called Sheffield Leaders in Prayer. And we've just been on an exciting journey of trying to listen to what Jesus is doing in Sheffield and kind of catching the glimpse of the back of his heel in the mist as we try and follow and discern. And I think so often this city work is about trying to sense where he's leading in the midst of quite a large, ambiguous space full of options, but knowing that there's a God who has a plan for the city. So we're really passionate about bringing the church together in prayer and mission in Sheffield. And this year we're on a sort of this is our third year now of running something called Arise, which kind of grew out of the pandemic. And Arise aims to be a menu of events and initiatives that churches can engage with to help empower their congregation. So we're really excited about seeing the local church grow. And what we want to do is equip believers in the city to be bolder in their faith. So we'll often use the language of what is the next step of boldness for someone in the city. So for someone, it might be their neighbor knowing they go to church, or the colleague they sit next to every day, knowing that they had a powerful experience on a Sunday. For someone else, it might be standing up in a cafe and sharing the gospel, but everyone has this next step of boldness. So that's what we're really keen to see happen. What's that next step of boldness? We want to connect churches and connect believers across the city, and we want to really engage people with this idea of us being disciples of Jesus and discipling those around us. So how have we done that? Well, the thing I'm going to talk to you about today is called a Rise March. So every March, from the 1st of March to the 31st of March, we invite people across the city to cover the city in prayer, and we use an app to help that. So I'll just share this. So this year we looked at the theme of cover, discover, and recover. So we wanted to cover our city in prayer, and we really encourage people to turn their daily action and activity into a prayer. So your daily commute, the school run, and we want to equip believers across the city to turn their natural engagement with their locality into a prayer. So cover the area in prayer. When we think about the next step of boldness, this year we really wanted to equip people to discover prayer needs in their local area. And so we did training around whenever I go for a meal, a waiter or waitress brings the meal to me and I say, I always like to pray before I eat. Is there anything I can pray for you about? And so we sort of equipped people with the language to be able to say to someone at the school gates, oh, thanks for sharing that with me. Is it okay if I pray for you this week about that? Because the offer of prayer is a deeply evangelistic offer, because packed within that question are so many assumptions that subvert the cultural norms of the day. By offering someone prayer, you're saying that you believe there's a God who's there, who listens, who cares, who you can have a relationship with, just in that one question. And anyone can ask a question, right? So that's part of the journey. And this year you were able to add those to an app. And churches across the city displayed these really large banners that said, our church is praying for you this Easter. Scan this QR code to submit your prayer request. So we had 60 of these 3-meter banners at different denominational churches across the city that people could scan. And if you scanned the QR code via moderation, your prayer would then end up on the app so people could pray for you as well. And then we really want to recover the true meaning of Easter for Sheffield. So we have specified a Rise event around Easter, Halloween and Christmas. So Halloween is called a Rise Hallow, and Christmas is called a Rise Advent. And what we're wanting to do is promote to the city that Easter is something to do with church, that Christmas, that Halloween is a time to shine a light. So in the realms of sociology, this would be called plausibility structure. So all belief systems need plausibility structures that affirm the validity of any belief. And just the fact that churches are united by putting banners outside reminds people in the city that there's something legitimate here for you to engage with, that's big, that's citywide. And the prayer app, which I'll share now, does that for believers across the city. The majority of people in Sheffield are in churches of 50 or less. But when you look at a map that shows hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people praying across the city, suddenly you have a picture of the people of God and the tribe of God in your city. So the more you pray on a street, the more it glows. So this is Sheffield at the end of this march. So the more gold a street is, the more times it's being prayed for, basically. But you can see here just this amazing picture, and we kept having people on the edges, technically outside of Sheffield, petition us to add them to the app. And here at Together for Sheffield, we'd like to say yes and kind of work out the details later. So even at the cost of geographical purity. So there you can just see loads of different communities getting involved, and these numbers are where different prayer needs have been uploaded. So, you know, if you go here, these, oh, didn't like that, isn't it? It is technology, that's a warning. And we always say it's not about the app. The app is a picture of the unity that goes on. We're not here to serve the app. The app's here to just give a sense of connection, and it's a tool that we want to use. So this year we prayer walked over 5,000 kilometers of the city, and over, I think, 104 different churches in Sheffield got involved this year. And we had 850 people actively use the app, but we know that some of them were doing that on behalf of whole churches, and probably over 1,000 believers across the city that got involved. And again, we're trying to just create a journey as a city of helping people connect and be part of something bigger than themselves. So let me see.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Utterly inspiring. Yeah. Great, isn't it, to have tools that just encourage us like that and help us see that we're part of something bigger. Ben, thank you. Again, don't go anywhere. I'm sure we're going to come back to you. But let's go on to Greg Smith from Eternal Wall. Greg, welcome. Thanks so much for being with us. Just give us a 1-minute update on what Eternal Wall is all about, and then just a few minutes on this topic of remembering.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so my name's Greg. I'm part of the team at Eternal Wall and have been for about 5.5 years now. So if you haven't heard of it, so essentially we're building a landmark about Jesus in the Midlands. So you'll see it on the screen. It's a Mobius strip design, which is an infinite shape. And we're building it just east of Birmingham. It's built of 1 million bricks, and every brick is linked to an answered prayer. So people will be able to come along and hold their phones up, and it will, for people who are tech savvy, it will use an augmented reality app to know where you are in relation to the landmark, and then it will bring up the answered prayers that are linked to each of the bricks. We estimate that around 800,000 people will see it every week. So that's from the M6 and M42 motorways. Birmingham International Airport has a flight path over it, and then HS2, if that happens, kind of curves around the landmark. So exposure-wise, it will be massive. That arch is 2.5 times the height of the Angel of the North, just for context. So people, you know, will Google what was that random arch in the sky, and suddenly they're reading thousands of testimonies of answered prayer, which, you know, that will look like all sorts of things. It could be yeses, but it could be the unexpected answers, the no's, the not yets. All of those we just want to share, like, the authentic stories of faith that are happening in this country. So yeah, Mark asked me to talk a little bit about remembering. So it was interesting what Paul said, just that idea that we do sometimes, it's very easy to kind of forget what God has done and is doing. I think our culture in general just is very demanding on the now. It's very instant. It just drags you into the next thing very quickly. But in scripture, so we've done a bit of research, and remembering is mentioned in 50 of the 66 books of the Bible, and there are over 1,000 scriptures that talk about remembrance. So it's something that's really clearly on God's heart. You know, you see a lot of, in the Old Testament especially, you see a lot of the stories repeated, a lot of the commands repeated. It's something that God really wants us to latch on to, is the power of remembering what he's doing and what he has done. One of my favorite examples, just for a bit of, you know, biblical basis, Joshua 3. God finally is leading his people into the promised land, and they come across the Jordan River, which scholars say at the time they arrived was sort of in flood. So it was full flow, you know, not just a stream, it's this gushing torrent. And they cry out to God and say, you know, this is the last hurdle to get into the promised land. God miraculously holds up the water of the river so that the entire Israelite nation can get across. And the Lord actually says, pick up 12 stones from the bottom of the river and lay them in a place called Gilgal in remembrance of what I've done here. So when your children say, what are those stones? You can say, oh, this was where God miraculously stopped the river and brought us into the promised land after, you know, 40 years of wandering and then hundreds of years in slavery. So, and I don't think these were little pebbles either. I reckon they were, you know, a dozen men each, kind of obelisk kind of size boulders. Just this really, so there's this really poignant command to remember by setting up sort of a monument. And actually there's a cool moment in Judges 3 where there's a guy called Ehud that has to assassinate a king. And it's the king, it's quite a memorable story because it's the king where it says he's so fat that the sword, like, it gets engulfed within him and disappears. But Ehud goes to assassinate this king, and it doesn't go into much detail, but it seems like he bottles it. He leaves again without assassinating the king. But there's a very brief moment where it says he sees the stones at Gilgal, and then he turns back again and he finishes the job and he kills the king and sort of frees Israel from this tyranny. And so it just seems that there's this real moment where remembering becomes a really powerful tool at transforming the Israelite nation, because he sees those stones and he says, oh, hang on, the God who's asked me to do this is the God who miraculously stopped floodwater and saved our nation. If he's done it once, he can do it again. He doesn't change. So just that idea of remembering is just so important. And I think that idea of visual reminders of what God's doing is really significant as well. I really like, Ben, what you said about having like a poster with a QR code where people can put prayer requests. And I was just thinking, imagine if you could have one of those for answered prayer. Like, imagine if people could come up and scan QR codes and see what God's doing in Sheffield, literally like that day, that week, that month, how powerful that would be. And we've used at Eternal Wall before when we've presented these cardboard bricks. They're actually toys technically, but they fold together like big Lego cardboard bricks, and we've got people to write things on them like healed of cancer, you know, restored relationship with my wife, and just build them up. And it becomes this really powerful visual tool just to see what God has done and to remember those stories and hold them in our hearts, because I think they're powerful weapons that to forget them, I think is a real shame when they have such power to transform and to bring hope. So that's kind of what we're doing with Eternal Wall, is just creating, you know, a visual reminder of what God has done. And again, something Paul said was really cool, just because we're trying to gather 75,000 stories from the heritage of the UK. So these are historic answered prayers from basically when Christianity arrived, so like 2nd century AD, I think we've figured out, up to the end of World War II. And we want to share those stories and make sure they're not forgotten. And, you know, if the story of the guy who founded the Samaritans had been lost, if that story had been lost, perhaps that transformation that's happening now in Lincoln wouldn't have been possible. There's like a framework and a faith that is built by hearing the story that's gone before and remembering it and realizing it for today. So I think that's really exciting. So I'm gonna after this, I'm gonna drop a link to a video that we have released like a year or two ago about Dunkirk, which a lot of you will know about, sort of the story of the soldiers in World War II getting rescued, because Hollywood's kind of whitewashed God out of that story, and we're trying to reclaim it now and say, actually, that Dunkirk is a massive answer to prayer. Probably not even one. It's insane, the series of events where God just made a perfect scenario for those men to be rescued. So I'll drop that in the chat afterwards. And yeah, I suppose my challenge for you is just to say, you know, can you remember the last time that God has answered a prayer for you? Or can you remember some answered prayers? And if not, perhaps it's I suppose a challenge to actually turn to God and say, you know, what have you done for me? Help me to remember those, and help me to realize that they're weapons. I think our answered prayers are weapons to really transform the world around us. So yeah, so if you remember your stories, share them with the people around you. I think a lot of the stories of what God has done in our lives, they're not just for us. I mean, I think there are some that maybe are just for us, but a lot of the times they're to be shared, they're to be told to increase faith and bring hope to those around us. And so I'd also encourage you, I'll drop the link in the chat alongside the video to share them with Eternal Wall, because I know I'm biased, but I think that this is going to have I don't think I can quite fathom. I don't think we have any idea actually the impact that this will have on the nation. I believe that it's going to be a catalyst for revival in this nation. Just having 1 million stories and more. We'll just keep collecting them because God's not going to stop answering. So we'll keep gathering them in somehow. But just having those stories in this heart of this nation accessible online across the world, I think it will be transformative. So I'd love for you to play a part in that and see how other people, I encourage other people to be part of that. So our tagline is make hope visible. So I'd love for you to be part of that and sort of help make hope visible to the generations to come. But hopefully that encourages you to do a bit of remembering. It's always a good reminder.
Brilliant message, Greg. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
And amazing that we have this opportunity to engage with Eternal Wall from all across the country. So I hope the message will be spread out through this network that are gathered here today. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Mark.